Hi everybody, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to my chapter 1, the study of life. I'm going to do a summary here for you. I like to just kind of go over the most difficult concepts for students. The book lists characteristics of life. So if you're living, you're organized, you require materials and energy, you can reproduce, you can respond to stimuli, um, you are able to maintain homeostasis or you're homeostatic, and you have the capacity to adapt. So let's look at each one of these in a little more detail. In the book, we have this nice figure showing you the levels of biological organization. You can read all of these, but you can see a biosphere is kind of the big umbrella, and everything else falls underneath biosphere. The very smallest down here would be an atom. So I would know the levels of biological organization and be able to give an example of each one. So what would be tissue? That would be something like nervous tissue here that they're showing you an image of, right? So be able to give an example of each and then realize that atoms are the smallest. And then up here, organism is the largest as it works its way up to the entire biosphere, which includes everything. So sometimes the question is also worded as most inclusive or least inclusive. So biosphere includes everything below it, so it is the most inclusive. And then down here we have an atom, which is the smallest, and so that is least inclusive. That's very specific. The other thing to notice is that as you go up, it includes everything below it. So right here, a cell. What do you need in order for something to be called a cell? Well, it has to have molecules and it has to be composed of atoms. There's a few more criteria that we'll talk about as we move through biology, but just go up to the next one, an organ system. What do you have to be an organ system? Well, you have to have an organ, you have to have tissue, you have to have cells, you have to have molecules, you have to have atoms. So whatever level you're looking at, everything below has to also be included in that level. So hopefully that made sense. Another requirement to be living is that you need materials and energy. So for us, this is kind of simple. We take food and we turn it into an energy source. And we'll talk about ATP, which is the energy that we use to do work within the body. Over here, they show you kind of a diagram or figure that we're looking at the sun. And what do plants do? Plants are producers. Plants are going to take the sun and they're going to turn it into food, glucose or food. Plants also release what? Yeah, oxygen, right? So then consumers, like an animal, is going to take the plant's glucose or food. So think of a carrot in the ground or a potato or whatever. And those consumers are going to ingest that food. They could also ingest meat, right? So you see the hawk trying to get the rabbit here. And so these are consumers, and they're, again, consuming food and breaking it down to produce the energy necessary for them to work or live. And then we'll come back and talk about fungi a little bit, but we have other types of organisms that are just going to break down decomposed matter, right? So if the hawk ate the rabbit and left the carcass behind, what do the fungi and also some bacteria can do this, can break down that carcass into its individual components, and those will be found in the soil. To be living, you also have to be able to reproduce and develop. So this is another McGraw-Hill image. It's not in your textbook, but I think it does a good job of showing that females create eggs, males create sperm. Those combine together to form a fertilized egg, and then eventually we grow that one cell up into a fetus, and then eventually it's born and it's a child, and then we have to be able to grow into our adult form. And then once we're at our adult form, then we can continue the reproduction process. Here's another image from, it's still McGraw-Hill, but this one's from an anatomy book, but I thought it's a really good response to stimulus example. So this person is stepping on a piece of glass. What automatically happens? You automatically pick your foot up, right? You don't leave your foot on the glass and go, well, ow, that hurts, and what do I need to do? You don't think about it, you just do, right? So that's respond to stimulus. Also, if you're living, you're going to exhibit some sort of homeostasis. So we can see here that I think the example they give you in your book is body temperature. And they said your body temperature varies throughout the day. So let's say this is 98.6, where normal body temperature is about. What happens during the day? It'll go up a little bit. Maybe at night it goes down a little bit. So all they're trying to show you is that there is variability, and homeostasis just makes sure that you always come back to this center line, or that you're trying to come back to the center line. So an example is here. Let's say you're getting really hot. You're outside in the sun and you're working and you're chopping wood. Your body has the ability to cool you down by sweating. So if you're in the sun and you're hot, you have temperature receptors in your skin, and they're going to send a message to your brain, and your brain's going to tell your body to start sweating. You're going to have the sweat on your body evaporate, and it's going to pull heat with you, pull heat with it as it evaporates, and then your body temperature is going to drop back down, hopefully closer to homeostasis. So they want you to get the idea that you have to be able to do homeostasis if you're living. You have to be able to adapt, which is the next slide, but this is adapting more to internal. And then the next slide, we're going to talk about adapting to the external environment. So here, we're talking about organisms have the capacity to adapt. So due to some sort of environment, species or certain individuals within a species might be able to have a better fit. So maybe they have some adaptation that makes them better suited to survive in a particular environment. Under adaptation, we talk about something called natural selection. So basically it's saying that one individual might have more reproductive success than another individual based on some characteristic that they have that makes them more desirable, right? So one individual within a species might have a particular trait, and then that trait is selected for, and then that particular trait persists in an environment. So this is how we get to evolution. So changes in the frequency of traits within a population. I guess I could think of something really simple, like maybe something like blue eyes. Why do most Scandinavian individuals have blue eyes? Maybe that trait was selected for by the population. So if you had blue eyes, that meant you were more fit or more able to take care of family and children. And so females selected that trait over and over again. Maybe you had an adaptation that made it easier for you to travel long distances when hunting. So let's say you had more stamina, your metabolism was higher, you did not store as much fat as somebody else. Those could all be advantages that you have that could make you more desirable or more fit for a particular environment, and then your chances of reproducing are higher, and now that trait becomes important and gets selected again and again and again. And then eventually evolution has taken place. And so I know this is a hard topic for some people, but I'm going to go to the next slide and I'm going to show you just some basics about evolution. I think sometimes the media blows things out of proportion and they try to make, sensationalize things. So let's just talk about the basics of evolution and not all of the other stuff that comes with it. So here's a slide kind of representing the theory of evolution. So I'm kind of doing twofold things here. This slide talks about domains and kingdoms, which will come up next. But bacteria is a domain. I'm going to put a D. Archaea is a domain, and eukarya is a domain. And then under eukarya, we branch out into 4 kingdoms. So you can think of those as subgroups. And we have protists, plants, fungi, and animals. And these bridge points here, these little white dots, are telling you that there was some adaptation that caused these organisms to basically split into separate groups. So here we had adaptation 1, here we had some other adaptation, then there's another, then there's another, then there's another. So all we're saying is that bacteria and archaea have some similar features along with eukarya, that they had to have all had a common ancestor at some point. So if you think about it, all three of these, we all have cell membranes. We all have DNA. And the DNA are made of the same codes, A, T, C, and G. So we use the same nucleotides to make our DNA. So there are some very basic similarities between all of these, and so we think that there has to be a common ancestor that came before all of these. And obviously these lines would represent millions of years. So they're also saying fungi and animals are more closely related. Compared to what? So protists out here, I have to go back 1, 2, 3 adaptations to get back here to protist. So this is showing you that fungi and animals are more closely related than, say, animals and protists. If you don't know what protists are, these are usually aquatic, kind of water. They're still in this eukarya group, so they have a cell with a nucleus, but usually you find them in water. It's also kind of our catch-all. If it's not a plant and it's not a fungus and it's not an animal, then it probably is a protist, right? So I guess read through the book. I want you to understand what evolution means, what natural selection means, what adaptation means, and realize that this is all the theory of evolution, and we base theories off of facts and research and everything that we know to date. So sometimes I hear people say, oh, well, it's just a theory. What we're saying is we've conducted experiment after experiment after experiment. All the facts that we have lead us to believe that this is true. That doesn't mean we can't change our mind. That doesn't mean that new facts won't be presented and we may have to adjust our theory. But we're saying this is our best guess to date, depending on all of the facts and research that we have done. So here are the categories of classification. So domain, remember that was bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, right? And then under eukarya, we had the 4 kingdoms. So again, they're trying to do most inclusive, least inclusive. So domain is the biggest umbrella that we have. And then we can do subcategories. Everybody has different mnemonics for memorizing this list or these categories of classifications. So I learned dancing karaoke players can order free grape soda. You can pick whatever mnemonic works for you. It's fine. And if you want to look these up, mnemonic starts with an M. So if you want to Google mnemonics, they have them for everything. For every discipline, every subject, you can look at mnemonics. Biology is basically the study of life, right? We've seen that definition probably a million times by now. But the process of science is kind of the systematic way in which we go about studying life. So this chart I think is funny because it looks really complicated, but it's not. We all do the process of science. We just don't think about it. So I'm going to start here with an observation. So an observation leads to some sort of hypothesis. This is some testable statement, something that you're asking. You see something and you're going, I wonder why this is like that. Let me come up with a reason, right? So you make a prediction, you carry out an experiment, you get some sort of data, and then you either reject or you accept your hypothesis. And this sounds complicated, right? But let's do one that's easy. So your observation is car won't start. What's your first hypothesis? You could say, my battery is dead, and that's why my car won't start. How could you test that? I know, we're like, this is so silly. You just take the battery out and you go get a new battery and you put the new battery in and you see if the car started. That's your experiment. So what happens if you replace the battery and then your car starts? You accept your hypothesis. My battery was dead, and that's the reason my car wouldn't start. Okay, what happens if you put the battery in your car and it doesn't start? Oh, we have to reject. It wasn't the battery. What do? Now I go to the next hypothesis. Maybe it's my alternator. Maybe I need to have that changed. And you keep going through this process until you get to the point where you accept whatever the hypothesis is. So even though this looks really complicated, try to think of another example of something that you've done in your everyday life that is using the process of science. And this process is what I'm talking about when I say, when we come up with a theory, it's not just a guess. It's our best guess based on many, many hypotheses being tested, many, many experiments being run, and us coming up with a conclusion based on all of this information. When we're creating experiments, the design matters. So we need to make sure that we have a control group, somebody that receives no treatment. Sometimes you've heard of the placebo group, right? The fake group, the group that's not receiving treatment. And then there's the experimental group, the one that actually does receive treatment. And you can have multiple experimental groups. So we usually are looking at the experimental variable and then the response variable. And they have other names. They're not, it doesn't, I guess, help identify what's going on as much as experimental and response, but they call the experimental variable the independent variable. That's the factor that's being tested. So let's say we want to test 2 different fertilizers to see which one makes plants grow better. The response variable, how did the item respond, that's called the dependent variable. The dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. So I have 2 fertilizers that I'm testing. I'm testing fertilizer A and fertilizer B, and I'm looking at plant growth. So the response would be, how high does the plant grow? Like, what's the height of the plant? What's the experimental variable? That's the thing that I'm changing, right? I'm giving them 2 different types of fertilizers. And then I would have to have a control, right? I'd have to have the plant growing on its own without any fertilizer so that I could see how the fertilizer is changing the plant growth or the height of the plant. I thought I would throw this slide in about data and graphing because one of the things that you'll notice when you do the labs is that the y-axis is always going to be the response, or what we call the dependent variable. So the y-axis is always going to be the thing that's changing. In our last example, it was plant height. The y-axis is always going to be the experimental variable, which we also call the independent variable. So this is showing you a standard graph. It's showing you that they looked at blood cholesterol levels. So they looked at how blood cholesterol changed over time in individuals. So maybe they gave them a drug and they were testing how their blood cholesterol changed over time when they were on the drug. So the independent variable was the drug treatment, and that goes on the x-axis. The response or dependent variable is how did the patient's blood cholesterol levels change over time. Well, that's it for my summary of Chapter 1. I hope you found it useful. If you have any questions, please just email me. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. And make sure that you're looking at those learning objectives, right? I've said this a number of times in the intro, but the learning objective questions, you need to answer those. And if you answer them, you're basically creating your own study guide for the exam, right? So every question that I ask you on the exam will come directly from a learning objective from one of the chapters within the unit. So again, email me if you have any questions. Bye.